Hey, hello, welcome everybody to today's workshop. I hope you're having a wonderful weekend, and I hope you're staying safe. Okay, so I try to not too much watch too much news or watch any of this stuff going on, but man, are things getting a little bit crazy around our country. So I hope you're staying safe, and I hope you're not in an area where all some of this stuff is going on, and that you're doing very well. In California here, it's quite nice. It's been a wonderful week. I was down in San Diego yesterday, and I actually got to spend a little time with one of my clients. Hey, Cindy, we had a great dinner together. So I've had a really nice weekend myself. So I hope you all are doing the same. Today, I wanted to bring up a subject that I just see a lot of people forget about. And when you are mapping out, a plan for in the neighborhood of 30 years or so, maybe it's 40 years for some of you early retirees, there's a big risk of one thing, and it's called inflation, right? So some people forget about inflation, and there is, general inflation. And then there's other things that go up faster than inflation sometimes. So, for example, the cost of healthcare has gone up more than the 2 or 3% per year. The cost of long-term care, which hardly anybody thinks about, by the way, has gone up much faster than that. Some areas it's as high as 7 or 8%, or maybe even higher, the average cost of long-term care going up. So I wanted to bring this to your attention today because every weekend when I do these workshops, it's all based on stuff that I hear people talking about, or I'm seeing gaps in people's knowledge. So what I'm trying to do is just really close the gap there. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Let me introduce myself for those that are new here. My name is Jason Hamilton. I am the founder of Keep It Simple Financial Planning. I'm a certified financial planner, and I also run this group and this page here. So if you need anything when it comes to your retirement planning, definitely reach out. But every Sunday about 2 o'clock Pacific time, 5 o'clock Eastern time, I'm going to bring you some sort of workshop to help you improve your retirement prospects and increase your knowledge. That's the ultimate goal. I want you to become more educated, more savvy, and more confident at the end of the day because this is something that comes up quite a bit as well. Is you're only planning one retirement, right? You have your retirement, and that's pretty much all you're looking at. You don't really look at other friends and family's retirements for the most part. In the last year, we've helped over 100 people create their retirement plans, right? So in the last couple of years, it's been a few hundred, over a couple hundred at this point. So I see these things a lot, and I've seen pretty much everything there is to see when it comes to mapping together a plan. So inflation is something that's very, very consistently missed. And some people think like, well, okay, if I have, Social Security that is, $2,500 and I have $1,000 pension, and my expenses are $3,500, well, then I should have enough to retire, right? Sounds good in general, but what happens a lot of times is, your Social Security is going to go up a little bit, probably not a whole lot, and your pension probably doesn't have a cost of living adjustment on it. And then you got to think about taxes, right? So these are things that a lot of times people just don't always put together. So again, we're going to talk about this today, talk a little bit about the history of inflation, what it could mean to you over your retirement time period, and I'm going to give you a little 3-step game plan on how to create your plan to kind of deal with creating your income plan for the next steps here. So let's jump right in and talk about that here. Okay. So I called this presentation, Inflation, Your Retirement, and Purchasing Power. Okay. Purchasing power is really what this is, the whole subject of what it comes down to here is the dollars you have today are not going to be worth the same as the dollars if you kept that dollar like in cash or under your bed or even in a savings account today where they pay basically nothing. It's not going to have the same purchasing power as it does today in 15 or 20 years. And so this is why we invest, over time so that we can keep up with inflation, in retirement. But a lot of folks don't really either like to invest money because they have a low risk tolerance, they're not sure how to do it, or they just, really like to have that feeling of guaranteed income, and so they buy things like annuities. The thing with annuities is very rarely will they have an inflation rider on it. And if they do have an inflation rider, then you're going to get a lot smaller value to start out with. So those things don't usually break even for about 15 to 18 years. So again, these are all things that you want to bring into your plan. So we'll talk about this today. As always, I have to mention that this workshop is for informational purposes. It should not be seen as investment, tax, or financial advice. It is purely educational. Okay, so hopefully you learned something today. Okay, so you hear this all the time, right? You need to make sure that your retirement savings at least keeps pace with inflation. I should say, after you're kind of drawing down, because ideally you don't want to draw too much down on your accounts. But what is inflation and how does it really affect your retirement savings? All right, so let's explore this a little bit here. Let's see. There we go. Okay, so in simple terms, inflation is defined as an increase in the general level of prices for goods and services, okay? So the cost of things goes up over time, right? If you remember how much bread and gas cost back in the 70s or 80s compared to what it can cost today, especially if you're in a place like me, like in California, where gas would, before all the oil crash, gas was at like $4 or $5 at some points, even over $5 in some areas. So gas was probably, 50 cents or 99 cents. I even remember it being about $1 when I started driving. So things definitely do go up over time. Deflation, on the other hand, is defined as a decrease in the general level of prices for goods and services. So there are things that have gone down over time because of different efficiencies, right? So there's also things that go down, but in general, most things are going to go up. Cost of food and living in general is generally going to go up. If inflation is high, let's say 10% as it was in the 70s, then a loaf of bread that costs $1 this year will cost $1.10 next year. Doesn't seem like a big deal until you compound that over time. But inflation in the United States has averaged around 3.29% from 1914, and that's through 2016. But it reached an all-time high of 23.7% in June 1920 and a record low of negative 15.8% in June 1921. So wild swings here, back in these days, and again, we'll talk about things that have changed since then. Many of you here will remember the high inflation rates of the 70s and early 80s when inflation hovered around 6% and occasionally reached double digits. Does anybody remember that? Was anybody that's watching this right now paying attention to inflation back in the 70s and 80s, or were you just having fun at that time, just getting through life? I'd like to hear. And if you did experience that and you do remember that, if you can leave me a comment and let me know, how is that affecting people? How are people feeling about it? And I'd love to hear some feedback on that. But for comparison purposes, the inflation rate in Venezuela averaged 32.47%. This is average, okay, from 1973 until 2017, reaching an all-time high of 800% in December of 2016. Okay, so I think we're all familiar with what has gone on in Venezuela. They're still having problems down there, obviously, but inflation getting too out of control is not a good thing. But that's when I found these numbers, I was pretty blown away by the average, right, from 73 to 2017 being 32.47%. So how does inflation affect your retirement savings? This is the all-important question. The answer is simple. Inflation decreases the purchasing power of your money in the future, right? So if you don't have any sort of increases on your money through whatever investment you might make, that the value of that particular dollar you have in your hand today is going to be worth less, and it's going to be able to purchase less in the future. So consider this. So at 3% inflation, $100 today will only be worth $67.30 in 20 years. So that's a loss of 1/3 of its value. So another way to look at this is that same $100 will only buy you $67.30 worth of goods and services in 20 years. So I think this is very pertinent for most people, because most folks here are going to be in their 60s, or so when they retire. And the average life expectancy these days, if you make it to 65, is about 84.5 for men and about 86.5 for women. And that means 50% of people are going to live longer than those ages. So there's a good chance that, in 20 years, you'll be experiencing what we're talking about here. And in 35 years, that $100 will be reduced to just $34.44, okay? So that's a pretty big deal. It's a pretty big deal. For you early retirees that are maybe retiring at 55 or 60, there's a good chance that you're going to, again, be impacted by this. And for those of you as well that are retiring early, most of you have pensions, right? So the folks that I speak to that are retiring in 50, 55, 58, most of them are retiring because they have a pension of some sort from either the government, teaching position, something like that. And so this is very real for those of you that are in this situation. So take this, please take it seriously. I would recommend that. So how is inflation calculated, right? Are we going to go into a bunch of ugly, boring math? No, we're not going to do that, okay? Fortunately for us, we don't have to calculate inflation. It's done for us. So every month, the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates indexes that measure inflation. So you can look this up anytime you want. There's the Consumer Price Index. So the Consumer Price Index is a measure of price changes in consumer goods and services such as gasoline, food, clothing, and automobiles. So these are the things that are going to impact you, right, on a pretty regular basis. The CPI measures price change from the perspective of the purchaser, okay? So that would be most of you folks, right? Most of you folks are the purchasers, so it would be affecting you from there. And then there's also a Producer Price Index, or indices, And that's a family of indices that measure the average change over time in selling prices by domestic producers of goods and services. So PPIs measure price change from the perspective of the seller. Okay, so those are kind of the two big ones there, and you can find those on that site. So how the Federal Reserve, one of their main goals is to attempt to control inflation, right? We talked about this a few weeks back after Jerome Powell's talk. Kind of broke some of that down, and their goals on average keep it around 2%. But up until the early part of the 20th century, there was no central control or coordination of banking activity in the United States. So in fact, the U.S. was the only major industrial nation without a central bank until Congress established the Federal Reserve System in 1913 with the enactment of the Federal Reserve Act. So with the Federal Reserve Act, the Congress had three very specific goals for the Fed. First one, promoting maximum sustainable employment. Okay, this is obviously important. We need to make sure people have stable jobs and things aren't going up and down with people losing jobs all the time. That can lead to instability. Stable prices, right? So for those of you that are big Bitcoin fanatics, the reason why Bitcoin hasn't really taken off that much is because the price stability is just not there. People don't feel comfortable yet using that, even though it could be a useful means of exchange to purchase and sell goods and services. The fact is, it's just not stable. And so, until you get something that's a little more stable, like the dollar or whatever it may be, cryptocurrencies are going to have trouble probably coming into the market. There are some other ones that are going to be tied to the dollar, but again, this is still things that they haven't really quite figured out yet. Okay, and then the third thing is to moderate long-term interest rates, right? So we'll talk a little bit about how those work. In order to help the Fed stabilize prices, Congress gave the Fed a very powerful tool, and that's the ability to set monetary policy. And this is what we're seeing right now, right? So we're seeing the interest rates that have dropped down to 0 to 0.25. And the reason the Fed's doing that is to try to encourage people to borrow, which in turn will ideally grow the economy or stimulate economic activity. That's the idea behind that. So like it says here, one way the Fed sets monetary policy is by manipulating short-term interest rates in an effort to control inflation. So, if the Fed believes that the prevailing market conditions will increase inflation, it will attempt to slow the economy by raising short-term interest rates, reasoning that increasing the costs of borrowing money are likely to slow down both personal and business spending. So if they think the economy is going to grow too fast and inflation will go up too fast, then they raise interest rates. As we just talked about, currently the interest rates have been dropped to basically zero. So like it says here, the flip side is true. If the Fed believes the economy has slowed too much, it will lower short-term interest rates in an effort to lower the cost of borrowing and stimulate personal and business spending. So this is what's going on right now. We're in the middle of a time where the Fed has brought interest rates down pretty much the lowest they've ever been. And there's a high likelihood we'll see negative interest rates at some point, right? So what that means is it's going to cost you money to keep money in a bank. So Japan's been doing this the last number of years. Other countries are looking at this. I think Germany's negative as well. So these are things that could be coming here pretty soon. So again, when you have money that you've saved, if interest rates, are at zero or below, and the cost of goods is going up, very quickly can that money you have, the value of it or the purchasing power of it, be severely diminished, right? So you have to have a plan here for this here, okay? And as you might imagine, the Fed walks a very fine line. So if it does not slow the economy soon enough by raising interest rates, it runs the risk of inflation getting out of control. And that's not a good thing. We don't want to have Venezuela here, okay? We want to keep this relatively under control. And if the Fed does not help the economy soon enough by lowering rates, it runs the risk of the economy going into recession. So there's some data that shows that we are probably currently in a recession. Maybe there's a case for making a depression, but we don't really know that yet until everything opens back up and we can get a more accurate representation of what's really going on. But number-wise, you could say that this could be true currently. So currently, the Fed believes that inflation at the rate of 2%, as measured by the annual change in price index for personal consumption expenditures, or PCE, is most consistent over the long run with the Fed's mandate for price stability and maximum employment. So what does this mean? To keep things, prices stable, to keep people in jobs. They don't want to have inflation really go above 2% too much, okay? So 2% is kind of their goal. I think that's probably a little bit conservative, but hey, you know what? That's what their goal is. So what do you need to remember as an investor? So it's very imperative that you have a long-term retirement strategy that accounts for inflation, okay? And that you prepare for a decrease in the purchasing power of your dollar over time. It's just what it's going to be. Your dollars are not going to be worth as much in 15 or 20 years or 25 years as they are today. So you want to have a plan to counteract against that. So to do this properly, you're going to have to strike that harmonious balance of keeping enough of your investment portfolio and growth assets to counter inflation while having enough funds set aside to pay for expenses in case of an extended market downturn. So this is the balancing act that you need to do as an investor with your retirement assets as you're moving to the next stage. A lot of people will just love to throw it all in an annuity, get 6 to 8%, and have a guaranteed return, and have life work out well. Unfortunately, they're just guaranteed interest rates aren't just paying that much. You're going to be lucky to get even inflation on that, and so you got to do some things a little bit differently here. Okay, so I want to talk to you a little bit about where to start, and we've talked about this before, but maybe some of you are new here. But the big thing that you need to do is you need to create a retirement income plan. Okay, so having a retirement income plan is really, really important to make sure that you have enough money that will last you over your retirement period, and you don't have to worry about running out of money. Okay, annuities can be a portion of that, but in reality, if you put all your money into an annuity, there's a very high likelihood that it's going to get very, very tight towards the mid or end of retirement. So having a balance and some growth assets in there are going to be really important. So where do you start? Number one is figure out the inflation adjusted, okay, very important, the inflation adjusted amount of income you'll need each year in retirement for your expenses. And so if you're 65 and you think you'll live till 90, you want to do a 25-year plan. If you're 60 and you think you'll live till 90, you want to do a 30-year plan. You want to go year by year and include inflation on, and even use different levels of inflation for different types of expenses. And then what I recommend is that you set up a time-segmented portfolio with different levels, with different portions of your assets at different levels of risk based on the time to distribution. Okay, so I like to break things up in somewhere 3, 4, 5-year periods. And let's say your first 5 years, that money could be very safe. The next 5 years, you might want to have something where you're going to get more than what you get in a savings account. And then years 10, 15, 20, and beyond, those are where you can add some growth assets to your portfolio, because over long periods of time, with a properly diversified portfolio, there's a very small chance of you actually losing money, and there's a very good chance of you actually making money and outpacing inflation. So highly recommend you do that. And then the step 3 is to monitor your plan on an annual basis and make adjustments as necessary. Okay, so we need to update these plans and make adjustments on an annual basis to make sure you're staying on track, because what you don't want to do is wake up 15 or 20 years from now, be very healthy, have a lot more time to go, and then see your accounts getting close to zero. Okay, so we don't want that to happen to you at all. So that's kind of a 3-step plan there. If that's something you're comfortable doing on your own, then that's great. But if you want someone like my help to discuss with that, then I offer free consultations, complimentary consultations, and we can talk about that. So you can go to keepitsimplefinancial.com/talk. Once again, that's keepitsimplefinancial.com/talk. So I hope you enjoyed this today. I hope you found it useful. What I want to do now is see if there's any questions. So I'm going to pause for any questions you may have and leave my website up there. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat here. So if there are no questions, then we can wrap up for today. But the big thing I want you to take away today, folks, is we need to have a plan for your money to grow, okay? You can't just leave it all under your mattress. You can't just throw it in your savings account for the next 20, 25 years. It's going to cause a lot more problems than a little bit of market volatility. And something I like to know as well is, we saw a little bit of dip in the market this week after a good increase recently. How did that make you feel? Were you feeling stressed out with this recent dip? Did you feel like, hey, it was just a normal dip in the market and I'm going to leave things the way they are? I'd love to hear your thoughts on, this current volatility and how you're feeling overall from an investor perspective. But other than that, I'm going to wish you guys a great weekend. Hope you enjoyed this, and I hope it helps you think a little differently and makes you more aware of some of the things you need to be planning for in retirement. And the invisible enemy is that inflation, okay? So have a great weekend. We'll talk to you guys next time. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to get back to them as soon as I can. Have a great day now. Bye-bye.